So, welcome everyone. This is the first event of this type we've had at Vanderbilt in 2 years. I'm very happy we are having this live event. But I also want to let you know that there are about 600 people online, so you're not alone. There are a lot of people tuned in to this event. I'm very excited about this event because we have Governor Bill Haslam and Ms. Cyntoia Brown-Long together in public at a public event for the first time since their paths collided dramatically in 2019. And it's really an honor to have you here and talk to us about the criminal justice system. Before we go deeper into that, I want to introduce myself. I'm Christopher Slobogin. I'm a professor here at Vanderbilt Law School, and I'll be moderating the discussion tonight, which is hosted, as you can see, by the Vanderbilt Project on Unity and American Democracy. I teach criminal law courses, criminal procedure courses, and I'm really looking forward to talking to the governor and Ms. Brown-Long about criminal justice issues. They have unique insights into criminal justice, especially as it operates here in Tennessee. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Now, we're going to talk about Cyntoia's study, if I may call you Cyntoia, Cyntoia's story, and use it to illustrate a number of different points about the criminal justice system, how minors are treated, the nature of the prison system, and sentencing, especially in Tennessee, and also sex trafficking, especially of minors. And then we're going to lean on Governor Haslam's expertise and vast experience to talk about how clemency might be used to put checks on punishment and various other issues that are relevant to the governor's control of the criminal justice system. So I'm really looking forward to that. We also hope to get into reform issues, not only what the criminal justice system is, but how it could be reformed. And I know both the governor and Cyntoia have a lot of ideas about how the system might be changed. So hopefully by the end of this evening, we'll have had a nuanced discussion about the criminal justice system and what it's like now, how it might be reformed. Now, I want to introduce our two panelists. I think you already know a lot about them, but I do want to introduce them in a little bit more detail. You've seen a little bit of Cyntoia's story. She was charged with homicide, killing an individual who had solicited her for sex, and she was sentenced to life in prison. And during her time in prison, she wrote a memoir, which you can see right here, and it's also, I think, for sale outside. It's called Free Cyntoia, My Search for Redemption in the American Prison System, and it basically documents her early years as well as the 15 years she spent incarcerated in jail and in prison. And I think it's fair to say Cyntoia's life from her early teen years until Governor Haslam granted her clemency in 2019 was a real roller coaster. And during those years, not only did, of course, she go through a trial and get sentenced to life, but there was a documentary made about her life. She found God and found faith, and she engaged in an unlikely romance, which is a very happy story now, and is now happily married. So that's all, I think, the stuff that will come out as we talk about her story tonight. Her case did attract national and international attention. There were social media advocates, there were pastors, there were celebrities like Rihanna and Kim Kardashian, all of whom found out about her case and advocated on her behalf. And of course then Governor Haslam, not because of that necessarily, but Governor Haslam did grant her clemency, and she was released on August 7th, 2019. So today, Cyntoia, along with her husband Jamie, who is in the audience, is the leader of the Foundation for Justice, Freedom, and Mercy. And in January 2020, the Vera Institute of Justice, which is a very big deal, by the way, recognized Cyntoia with its Best of Justice Reform Award. And then just today, what timing, she found out that she received the Leadership Prize from the Juvenile Law Center in Philadelphia. So congratulations, Cyntoia. That really is terrific. The Juvenile Law Center is a very big deal. It's had a lot to do with juvenile justice reform in this country. She's currently the Assistant Director of the Center for Business as Mission at Lipscomb University School of Business here in Nashville. Now, I don't need to introduce our other panelists, but I will. Bill Haslam, he was a two-term mayor in Knoxville, and of course he was a two-term governor of Tennessee. And in 2014, he won an election by the widest margin of any gubernatorial candidate in Tennessee history. Among his other accomplishments during his tenure, Tennessee became the fastest improving state in the country in connection with K-12 education and the first state to provide free community college or technical school education to all of its citizens. Right now, he's serving on the board of Teach for America and the board of Young Life. In the fall of 2019, he became a visiting professor in the political science department here at Vanderbilt, and in January 2021, he launched the Vanderbilt Project on Unity and American Democracy, along with his other two co-chairs, John Meacham and Samara Ali of Vanderbilt University. And I want to say a few words about the project because they are the organization hosting this event. The idea behind the project is to try to bridge the gap that exists today within our country, to use research and evidence as a way of pivoting the country more towards the center and providing solutions that move democracy forward. So in the spirit of the project, we're going to have a discussion with Cyntoia and the governor. I want to start with you, Cyntoia.
Okay.
So we know a little bit about your history already, a little bit about your story already, but I think it'd be great if you could fill in some of the gaps, give the audience some idea of the pivotal moments in your journey through the criminal justice system and how those moments made you into the advocate for justice that you are today, as we learn through the Juvenile Law Center and these other institutions that have given you awards.
So long before I found myself in an orange jumpsuit at the age of 16, I was a kid who really struggled in school. And as I was struggling in school, I found that there weren't many people who really took the time or effort to help me figure out why I was struggling or what it was that was causing me to have difficulties or connect me with services. Instead, what I found was I kept getting pushed out to ISS or suspensions, and eventually I was expelled from public school. I found myself in an alternative school surrounded by some kids who had done a lot more serious things. And they were in custody, they were on probation, and needless to say, I started getting involved in some pretty heavy things at that age. I ended up catching a charge and going before the juvenile court at the age of 13. And once I went before them, they sent me to state custody. I was placed in state custody, shuffled around to different residential treatment centers, which actually offered very little in terms of treatment. They actually functioned more like warehouses. They shoved some pills down our throat, but that was basically it. And so I ended up running away from there, tired of the volatility that I was encountering there, like many kids in DCS, and I ended up living on the streets of Nashville. I lived on the streets of Nashville for 2 years maybe, until I met the man that started to traffic me. And I had been out there and met the man that I ended up catching a charge for shooting him, and that's how I ended up in a jumpsuit.
So we're going to explore a little bit more of that story as we go on this evening. But I want to focus on one aspect of that story right now, which is the process that brought you to trial. You were arrested at the age of 16.
Yes.
Now, most people who commit crime before the age of 18 are tried in juvenile court. And juvenile court, for those of you who don't know, is separate from adult court, is much more rehabilitation-oriented, not as punitive as the adult system is. So dispositions tend to be more lenient than they are in adult court. At least they're supposed to be more lenient than they are in adult court. But some juveniles, some people who commit crimes before age 18 are transferred to adult court, which is what happened to you. You were transferred from juvenile court to adult court. Now, many scholars and many of my colleagues argue that anyone who commits a crime even before the age of 21 should be tried in juvenile court, that nobody should be transferred to adult court before the age of 21. And other people argue, based on brain science, which has taught us that brains don't reach full maturity until age 25, many people argue that even up to that age, people should be treated differently than adults. And even the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, has sort of jumped on board with its decisions exempting people who commit their crimes under age of 18 from the death penalty and from mandatory life without parole sentences. At the same time, of course, young people can commit very serious crimes. And in fact, most violent crime in this country is committed by people between the ages of 15 and 25, so the public will often want punishment, and serious punishment in those cases. So, Cyntoia, I'm curious, how does the tension between those two perspectives get resolved? I know you've done some thinking about this. Should we get rid of transfer? Should we raise juvenile court jurisdiction age 21 or 25? Should we do something special with juvenile sentences that recognize their youth, or should we keep things pretty much like they are? What are your thoughts about that?
I think right now, like, you have two extremes, and you have a juvenile court judge who's hearing this case, and so there are some cases which are more serious. So you can't say, well, let me send you to the Department of Children's Services for 2 years, and let's hope that they can help you in that time frame. Or you go get 51 years. Like, there's no in between. So I definitely think that we need to have something, whether it's like a separate entire system where it's for youthful individuals, or the young adult system where someone can go there between the ages of 15 and 25 and receive intensive rehabilitation services until they can be released. I think that that's an option. There's also another option where we can take our sentencing statute as it is now, and where we have standard offender, we have multiple offender, persistent offender, career offender. Let's plug a different statute in there that says, okay, well, now you have juvenile offenders. And so instead of for Class A you getting 15 and 25 years, okay, juvenile offenders for Class A you would get, let's say, 6 to 10 years,
with the
or something like
rehabilitation
that.
focus.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Which that's a completely different story, because that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, you used the word
Completely in
warehouses a
prison.
little bit earlier to describe what the kinds of facilities you were put in. So I take it that's a real pet peeve of yours.
It is. A lot of box checking going on.
Governor, do you have any thoughts on this issue? I want to ask you about clemency in a moment, but I was wondering if you had anything to add here.
So many. And I think I think Cyntoia brought up a great distinction. If you're sentenced as a juvenile, they can only sentence you for how long?
So Tennessee jurisdiction is 19.
Right.
If you're sentenced as a juvenile, and we say sentence, but it's you get adjudicated, and you're not supposed to be treated like a criminal. So we really shouldn't even be looking at it as like, well, this is the punishment for the crime, because the whole purpose of the juvenile court system is supposed to be removing the taint of criminality. You're not supposed to be treating them like little criminals.
Right.
So I think that's something we need to get into as well.
Yeah, I think the nomenclature in juvenile court is quite different. At least in theory, you're adjudicated, you're not found guilty, and you receive a disposition, not a sentence. And it's all designed to create this, at least the patina of a rehabilitative ethic. Now, whether in fact that occurs is another story.
One of the things that I wanted to bring to this discussion is some personal insight. Like Cyntoia and I, in some way, we grew up in the same state, but worlds apart. Cyntoia is I think I'm right, biracial daughter of adopted black parents, and in and out of state institutions all of her life. My first contact with the state was when I went to get a driver's license. Okay, and so even as I read her book, I thought there is a lot of insight into all these different state institutions. It's really easy to make DCS the bad guys in the picture. What I've learned in government is we're a lot better at fixing broken potholes than we are at fixing hearts, and we don't do a great job of thinking through. This is a human created in the image of God that we're dealing with, that is intertwined in the state system, and it's different. I mean, like right now, we have a very practical issue at DCS. Given we have a hard time right now, we see where the economy is. It's a hard time hiring people to work at really easy jobs. DCS is not an easy job,
right.
And so you're dealing with a lot of complex and hard situations of frontline workers who are trying to go into homes and decide, am I going to leave that child in that home or not? So I think we have to begin with recognizing the degree of difficulty. That being said, I think those of us who end up on the government side need to realize, like, we can't look at this as check the box. And sometimes there's such a tendency because of the mass of what comes at you, like, how do I do my part and keep this moving along? And where we can realize, like I said, what Cyntoia does a great job is that these are not short adults. These are young people who a lot of different things have happened in their life to put them in circumstances that some of us, like that, when the world she describes in her book, that was a foreign world to me.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that because we talked a little bit last week, and you talked about this disconnect between what actually occurs in prisons and what people in the legislature and the executive branch think occurs in prisons. And I want to come back to that point in a second, but if I could, I want to get to the clemency issue because, of course, eventually you did decide that,
right.
Cyntoia, should be given clemency. And I want to clarify there are two different kinds of clemency. There's commutation, which is what happened in Cyntoia's case, where the sentence is shortened, and then there's pardon, where often the person's released, but also certain legal impediments that are associated with conviction disappear, like the inability to vote, inability to get licenses for jobs, and various other negative consequences of a conviction. So Cyntoia, your sentence was commuted by Governor Haslam. So I wonder what went into that decision about Cyntoia's case. And I think it must have been a difficult one, because the Parole Board, which is the entity that makes recommendations to the governor about clemency,
had a split.
Yeah. I mean, there are two parole members who recommended commutation, two who rejected it, and then two who said commute, but only after 25 years, not after 12 years. So how did you make your decision in Cyntoia's case?
And I've told people this, Cyntoia and I have really become friends since then. She and Jamie and Chrissy and I have gotten a chance to share meals, and she's really easy to like, okay? So it's fun to see.
So it was definitely the right decision, you're saying.
No question. I had some that weren't, by the way. But, you don't, I always said this, our lives intersect with other people all the time. And when you're governor, you make a lot of decisions that impact people, but you don't always get to see it from their side. And in this case, I always say I've gotten to see the backside of the tapestry and what happened kind of from her perspective. So that's great. So a couple of things. Some of you heard me say this. I'd made a big mistake as governor. As governor, and you have the power to grant clemency or pardon or exoneration even is almost total. Unless you're getting paid money for it, you can do whatever you think is best, okay? And I had gotten some advice when I went into office that said, everybody and their brother is going to be coming up to you asking for a pardon or getting something taken, their DUI from college taken off their record, whatever. Don't do it. Just wait till your last few months in office, and then you won't be being besieged by people. And I said, that sounds smart. And that was not smart. It was a big mistake, because you had this flood of things that came to you, and you thought, I can be smart enough to figure this out. When they bring it, I'll say, okay, this person should get off, that person should. You thought, I can figure all that out, and you can't. It is really hard to be just and merciful at the same time. It is just, and every case they brought to me, I'd go, that's a hard one. Let me think about that. That's a hard, and they finally said, Governor, our hard one stack is getting taller, and our solved, issues are not getting shorter. So I put that into context, and you might say, well, it's just really easy. You should be just to everyone, but I can tell you a lot of stories of governors who let people off that wish they hadn't. So it doesn't work that out. In hindsight, to be honest with you, Cyntoia's case itself was never a really hard one for several reasons. I do think we have a whole different perspective of what sex trafficking looks like now compared to then, and I'll let her talk more about that. But I had become clear that, like I said, no teenage girl chooses to be on the street selling herself. That's just not how it works. Number two, we understand a lot more about adverse childhood experiences and how that shapes or doesn't shape the human development. And so in Cyntoia's case, had a lot of those adverse experiences. We knew that if she was sentenced now, she probably wouldn't get that sentence. I mean, I could keep going. And then she had some of them here. She had some incredible folks working pro bono for her. Mr. Bone, Mr. Yarbrough, some others are here. And they literally had done an incredible amount of legal work. So they'd kind of done our work for us. And then finally, I just, through Cyntoia's association with Lipscomb and other folks, I just knew a lot of people that had gotten to know her, and they kept saying, she's a real deal, she's a real deal. And so to be honest with you, her case was pretty easy compared to some others.
Right.
Here's what made it hard. She had gotten so much attention, and I had to make certain we weren't treating her different, better or worse, because she had gotten so much attention. And that was really hard because I found out in the process there were like 80 other juveniles who had life sentences, and I thought, well, we need to look at all those. But by this point in time, it's like 6 weeks to go. Like they didn't all have folks that had done all this great legal work for them, so I wasn't able to. That was the hardest thing: is how do I not treat her as special? But now that I know that I really don't think she should stay in prison that long, how do I let her? So that was what the hard part for me was. Her case, to be honest with me, felt like a really clear one, and it still does.
But what you're saying raises, I think, an interesting issue. Do you think clemency ought to be used more aggressively by governors and by the President of the United States, who also has the authority you're talking about, if there are enough people to advocate for people like Cyntoia?
I'll say this, I found a lot more cases, like I said, I didn't leave myself enough time, and I hate it, but I found a lot more cases that I thought we need to dive into that. Somebody needs to understand that situation better. And so it's part of what led me to think, I do think we have too many juveniles serving too long, and we took too many people with nonviolent crimes serving too long. Now, I don't know, I can't go real deep on exactly how do we fit that, but my viewpoint of my peering into the judicial system is we have too many people serving too long.
Amen.
Yeah, so I want to get to that and ask you a question, Cyntoia. Now, as this demonstrated, you were sentenced to life, and in Tennessee, you're not even eligible for parole until you've served 51 years in prison. I think it said you would have been 67.
That's right.
If it had gone 51 years. Tennessee is the only state in the country that does that, but there are a lot of states that do limit parole eligibility. In other words, they have a significant amount of time before you're eligible for parole. So I want to ask you about that. Right now, we have many, many people committed crimes as juveniles serving life sentences. In the United States, across the board, 10% of all prisoners are serving life without parole sentences, people who committed crime as adults or juveniles. 10% of the people in the prison population are serving life without parole. And then in a number of other states, we have what we have here in Tennessee, where parole is a possibility, but not for a very, very, very long time. So based on your experience, but also on your study of the system, what do you think about that? Are sentences too harsh? Should we make sure that everyone is eligible for parole at a fairly early point in their sentence? Now, maybe they wouldn't be granted parole, but at least be eligible for parole much earlier than 51 years, and maybe be eligible to be considered every year or every 2 years. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I have a lot of thoughts.
I figured you did.
I think it's absolutely ridiculous to consider 51 years as a chance for parole. So let's say you're 21. You're going to be 72 years old, a chance for parole. When you get out, where are you going? What are you going to do? Where are you going to work?
If you live.
How are you going to survive? Exactly. That's the part. And so even like juveniles, like the life expectancy, what life is there after that? And so it seemed like somebody was like, okay, well, let's make it look good. Let's make it seem like there is a parole. But really, there's no difference in Tennessee between life without parole and life with parole. And so you spoke earlier about the Supreme Court mandate about not sentencing juveniles to mandatory life sentences, life without parole sentences. And that's exactly what this is. It's just dressed up in, a skirt here in Tennessee, because it's mandatory that if you were convicted of first-degree murder or felony murder as a juvenile, you get 51 years in prison.
Yeah, it's called a de facto life sentence without parole.
Exactly. So I definitely think that's something that needs to be addressed, and I know there is a case now pending before the court, the Booker case, so hopefully that's something that we'll push through.
By the way, if you can't tell, Cyntoia could be a lawyer. She just doesn't have the degree. She knows her stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think that's interesting, and it is, I think, an issue that every state has to confront. Again, Tennessee is the only state with this particular kind of provision, but every state has a similar kind of restriction on when people are eligible for parole. In fact, a lot of states have gotten rid of parole entirely. About half the states in this country do not allow people to be released on parole. They have what's called determinate sentencing. So it's a very real issue in terms of making sure people get second chances. Unless the governor steps in and grants clemency, there's no chance of getting out for a very long period of time. And it's my understanding that right now the Tennessee legislature is considering a bill that would require people to serve 100% of their sentence for certain designated crimes. Now, I don't know if that will pass. We'll see if it does.
There is a bill that has, it's at least being seriously discussed.
Right.
And I don't know enough the possibility.
Yeah. But I think it's very possible it will pass. And of course, that's going exactly the opposite direction of what we're talking about here.
Well, yeah, if they're not going to reduce the sentences along with it, so are you going to cut the sentence in half? Because, people change, and the people that I've been incarcerated with, after they've served like 20-something years, they're completely different people. And these are the ones that everyone looks up to. Like the people that I looked up to when I was there, who encouraged me to get involved in the college program, those were people that had licenses that had been there 15, 20 years, but they were living lives of meaning and of purpose there, and they were inspiring others. They were role models. They're not the same person that they were whenever whatever happened. So why can't they have that opportunity to go before the parole board?
Right. And so if the governor doesn't act, there should be a parole board possibility, is what you're suggesting.
Yeah, I think obviously I'm a proponent for clemency, but when you think about it, this is one person, and you have
Clemency is not the answer.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's,
I mean,
I think
doesn't-
you're right.
Parole
Scale
reform,
doesn't work.
Yeah, parole reform is the answer.
Right.
I mean, even like on clemency, you have the parole board that acts as this barrier. So for many people, it's you file a petition for clemency, you just hope and pray that somebody can get it to the governor because it most likely is going to stop at the parole board. One of the women that I just spoke to you about, the one that encouraged me, she served 51 years. Everyone knows this woman. Like Erica is like the saint in the prison, does nothing.
You talk about it in your book. Yeah.
Yeah, and she literally went up for her clemency hearing of the parole board, and they recommended that she serve like 30 more years. And it's like, really? And so it's like, is the governor going to get to see her petition? Who knows? Because many times it just dies there. So.
Governor, can you speak to who's on the parole board? The
Yes.
kind of people, I mean, you appoint them, right?
You do, and it's, I'm trying to think the right way to say this. You don't, when you become a governor, you don't all of a sudden like have this great body of wisdom. You think about
sure.
everything that happens as governor. I mean, we have 22 state departments. We educate 4-year-olds, we educate PhD students, we run corrections department, and we build roads, and we help folks with mental health issues. You know, I can keep going. And you don't really, it's not drinking from a fire hose, it's drinking from a waterfall, okay? And you literally, there's just no way that you can understand that. The problem is, a lot of people come back to you and say, what's your philosophy on this? And you just literally, you don't know enough. And so I say all that to say, when I first became governor, I didn't have a well-developed philosophy of how I looked at parole. I had never really interacted with the criminal justice system. I didn't know what I thought. And it's not like in your first years you have a lot of time to go off by yourself and read and develop that philosophy. So my point would be the governor has that, and I think it's better to be with the governor than anywhere else. But he or she takes a while to think about, well, what kind of person do I want on that board? And I thought, well, I need some really good citizens on there. But I didn't think about enough about what's my philosophy around parole?
Because there are different approaches to parole boards, and,
Sure.
and one approach to parole board is to have experts who know about treatment programs, who can assess risk, and who can really individualize the evaluation of the individual, as opposed to people who are good citizens but nonetheless don't know any of that stuff.
Right.
And you might get a very different decision depending on which type of person you have on the parole board. So let's talk about this disconnect that we've already mentioned once. I know you and Cyntoia
Right.
have talked a lot. And Cyntoia, when we talked, you did mention this disconnect between what actually goes on in prison and what people in the legislative and executive branches know. So what would be a remedy for that? I mean, should governors go around visiting prisons and talk to prisoners? I mean, you're already doing so much as governor.
Well, and
I mean,
you do some
how
of that,
can
but it's like, I mean, part of the problem, right, is, again, think about all the state does, like I just said, and we have 40,000 employees. It's, you can only do so much that, so I look at it as trying to continually change push the trajectory in a different direction through who you put in charge of prisons and who they hire, et cetera. But it takes a long time to move a big ship like a state.
Right. So, Cyntoia, you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I honestly
solving the
think,
disconnect?
I think that, and the same with DCS. I know we were speaking about DCS, and you spoke about how many good people are in DCS, and I know that to be true, but a lot of the people who are housing kids in DCS, they're private companies, and there's nobody who's monitoring that contract to see what's actually going on in those facilities. When it comes to the Department of Corrections, the governor doesn't know what's going on. And I'm going to tell you, the commissioner doesn't know a lot of what's going on. If the commissioner ever walks into a prison, I can tell you that for days, there have been many of us who have stayed up for hours, sealing the concrete floors, painting the walls, making everything look nice and pretty. You're told that you can't speak and say certain things. You have to make everything look nice and appear as though it's perfect. All the paperwork is in order. So everything is like this facade. You never really see what's really going on. So I feel like there need to be more people who are actually impacted by these systems to have a voice at the table. We need to have committees. We need to have, and when I say committees, I mean committees where changes are actually implemented after those suggestions are made. We need to have people who are performing the audits that aren't just other people from other prisons or who are already in the system, but some people who don't really have a connection to TDOC doing these audits.
And the committees would include prisoners.
Absolutely,
Yes.
they should. Absolutely, they should. Family members,
So
people who can really talk about what's going on.
Yeah. I think that's a great idea. Your book does a great job describing what prison life is like. I found it fascinating. Some of the phrases you guys invented, like badgitude and body snatching.
It's a thing.
And you were also in isolation, right, for a while. And I think, I don't know if you'd be willing to talk about it now, but I think it'd be interesting to say a few words about what it's like to be in a prison and how what happens in prison affects the attitudes of prisoners and their ability to rehabilitate.
I mean, you literally feel like you're constantly fighting against this hopelessness. And so even when you have it in your mind, like, man, I'm gonna do the right thing. I wanna change. I wanna be a better person for myself, for my family. I wanna take this class. You're running after barrier after barrier after barrier. If you do get in class, you have people who are trying to get you kicked out of the class because they don't want you to think you're too good, or, you know, and so it's like, there's always something. And it's just like, for some people, they give up. And then it's like, well, man, like, why am I constantly fighting for what? If I have no chance for parole, if I have no chance to do this, and I'm still gonna be here, I still have this long sentence over my head. There's nothing that's rewarding. There's nothing that makes me feel like I'm really progressing. So what do I have? And so that's when you see like a lot of people just kind of give up because there's nothing there. Like, you don't have real rehabilitative programs. The rehabilitative programs that are actually doing some good within the prisons, those are volunteer-based. Lipscomb University, that was volunteer. They funded that, they fought for that.
It was hard to get into that program.
Many of the programs that are, you know, the federally funded programs that the state will get federal funds for, those classes like that are mandated, like group therapy and thinking for a change, things like that, you go in there, you read some Xerox copy handout of repetitive questions of things that don't even really apply to you. And it's like, how does this help me? When I was sent to the annex before I was actually supposed to be going home, instead of me receiving the programs that would really be helpful to me to learn how to balance a checkbook, to learn how to get insurance, to learn about insurance premiums and policies, to learn about all of these things that I would actually use and I actually needed, I was sitting there going through a notebook. Well, what do you do if somebody walks up to you with the gram of dope? What do you do? And it's like, I don't even have drug issues. I haven't used drugs in like 15, 16 years. And then it was just weed. Like, why am I doing this? And so it's like, there needs to be a lot of work in actually the programming that's being provided because it makes people feel like there's no hope.
Tell us about badgitude. I love that word.
Oh, man. So badgitude, and it's not just like confined to prisons. Like, there's people out here patrolling the streets who can have badgitude. And badgitude is kind of just, you know, it's an attitude that you have just because you carry a badge and you feel like you can ruin someone's day just because you have the badge and you have the power to do it. So that's what badgitude is.
I love that word. I mean, I talk about this in class, but I had never settled on a good word for it. That's a perfect description.
Badgitude.
Okay, so I want to shift focus a little bit to your arrest. After your arrest, you were interrogated by the police, which is fairly common in a homicide case. And I think we have a clip here of about 2.5 minutes worth of your interrogation. And I just want you to tell us what was going through your mind while this was happening. So can we roll the tape, if you will?
Okay. All right. I'm going to read your rights, okay, before we get started, okay? So, okay. It says, you have the right to remain silent. Do you understand that right? Yes or no? Okay. With that right in mind, do you wish to waive that right and answer questions now? Say yes or no?
Yeah. What, you recording me or something?
No, I mean, I just, you know, you just nod your head. I don't, you know.
He's reading the paper, he's looking down, he can't see you.
Yeah. Before we continue, there are additional rights that you must understand. Anything you say can be used against you in court. You have a right to a lawyer for advice before we ask you any question and have the lawyer with you during questioning. If you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be provided to you free of charge before any questioning if you wish. Now I'm going to read you a waiver of rights and I'm going to ask you to sign this after I read your waiver of rights. This is, I have read the statement of my rights or had the rights read to me, and I understand what my rights are. I am willing to make a statement and answer questions. I do not want a lawyer at this time. I understand and know what I am doing. No promises or threats have been made to me, and no pressure or coercion of any kind has been used against me.
Promises of what?
I mean, I'm just saying I'm not, you know, you're not, we're not promising you anything as far as like, you're not,
as far as helping me, if I talk.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You're not promising me as anything as far as helping me as I talk, but you just promised me that.
Right.
And that's saying that
No,
no
what-
one has promised me that, but you have.
Well, I'm sure we will do everything we can to help you, if we can, you know. Whatever we can do to help you, we will. Like I said, this is
Yeah, he told you across the hall, I mean, you know, he was gonna read those to you and whatever you told him, he would do what he could to help you, meaning that he would sit down with the DAs and talk to
talk to
them and, you know, tell them you were cooperative and, you know, basically just tell them the truth. I mean, that you're not a cold person, I mean, and just tell, he's just gonna tell them the truth. And that's all anybody can do for you.
yeah.
So there's a budding young lawyer at the age of 16
But I gotta,
trying to
like,
understand
do you
their rights.
remember that moment? Do you remember that moment? Okay.
So what was going through your mind? What were the promises all about that were alluded to here?
So number one, the promises were illegal. Let me just say that for anybody who's going to law school. So in a separate room, and this is one of the things that I talk about many people don't see. You wouldn't see that because it always happens in
It
a
wasn't on
separate room where it's not on tape, where they talk to me about, okay, if you talk to me and we go in here, then that could be the difference between you serving 9 years in prison and 99 years in prison. I'm a 16-year-old kid, 3 o'clock in the morning, like, okay, cool, I get it. I don't want to do 99 years. I'll talk to you because I'd rather do 9. Who wouldn't? And so all of these, manipulative tactics, these coercive tactics, that's what happened in a room where you weren't on camera. But thankfully, I had the wits about myself for just a second to say, wait a minute, you did promise me leniency. You did promise me that if I talked to you, this would happen. And, they went through some confusing explanation that I kind of was like, okay, well, I guess that's still the same thing. But, what if I had my parent there? What if I did have someone else there who actually could have saw through that and said, no, we're leaving. We want counsel.
Did they make any effort to contact your adoptive parents?
No, so after the fact, so whenever I met them, I did say, because I was with my trafficker, that I was 19 so that he couldn't be penalized for it. But still, they never made any kind of attempts before they got me in the room to verify who I was or how old I was or anything like that. And I feel like, that was a misstep.
And you were just saying you were 19 to protect him at that point, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And so the Supreme Court of the United States has held that it's okay for the police to lie to suspects during interrogation. They specifically have said that, so long as the deception doesn't coerce the individual. So did you feel pressure during this because of the promise? Or did you just
Well, that's
think,
the only reason I did it. I didn't want to do 99 years. So even though you can lie,
your choice was
you can't-
99 years or 90?
Right, you can't promise leniency because
Right.
that's coercive.
Right. And was this ever litigated in your case?
It was, and unfortunately, we did not get the suppression that we asked for. But
Right.
that was a huge red flag. Whenever my original attorneys, Rich McGee and Wendy Tucker, saw that, they filed for a suppression of it. And there was, these factors, all these different factors that they weighed, and so it wasn't like anybody said, "Wait a minute, this isn't right."
Yeah.
This is
So
clearly
what
not right.
Cyntoia
Let
is
me
talking
turn
about
this
is the
around.
courts look at a confession in the totality of the circumstances. That's the
That
language
one.
that the courts use. And so apparently what the court said is, oh yeah, well there's this promise which may have been a little coercive, but otherwise they acted fine. And she at least was claiming she was 19, even though she was only 16. I don't know what the court said, but this is one thing the courts do quite often. Even though there's clear evidence of coercion based on this promise, there were enough other circumstances that I guess the court thought would alleviate the coercion. This is unfortunately something that happens relatively routinely in the interrogation room. And often we don't have a tape of it. Fortunately, we have a little bit of this tape. But of course, as you said, we don't know what went on in that other room, and that's often the case, is the police do a lot before the tape is turned on.
Right.
And I'm not claiming that happens in all police departments, but it is something that is concerning. Governor, do you want to say something about this? Okay. So I also want to ask you a little bit more about the trial itself. I mean, it was an adversarial process, of course, and the only thing I want to ask you about is the way the prosecutor made you feel. You talk about this very eloquently in your book, and not necessarily even blaming the prosecutor, but what was your reaction to the prosecutor's statements during the trial?
I mean, all throughout the process where he was prosecuting me, I felt like it was something personal that he had against me. And it was like he hated me, and I didn't understand why. And he was just like really determined to paint me out to be like this horrible person, which, I mean, that's not your job as a prosecutor. Your job as a prosecutor is to look at the facts and say, well, this is my interpretation, and this is what likely happened, and it meets these grounds. And it's not to hate me and paint me as this horrible person. And I remember there was this one moment at my trial during closing arguments, and my attorney had this picture that my trafficker had taken of me, and it was folded up, and he said, look how dead she looks in the eyes. Like, she's miserable. Look what she was going through at this time. Like, try to connect with her on that. And the prosecutor took that photo off the desk and unfolded and said, now look at the rest of the photo. And it was a picture that my trafficker had taken of me naked. And he felt that it was so important for him to just shame me like that before the jury, and like that was a reason why they should convict me even more.
Was there an objection at that point, out of curiosity?
I mean, it happened, so what do you do?
Yeah, right. I mean, the jury can't wipe that out of his mind, but I was just curious.
Yeah, I think everybody was in shock that he actually did it.
There's another interesting part of your book where another prosecutor who signed on to the appellate brief for the prosecution, arguing that you should continue to stay in prison, got to know you in prison, right? And so what was that? Because I think it's actually sort of the reverse of what you just described with respect to the trial prosecutor. What happened with that prosecutor?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that prosecutor actually happened to be my very first instructor when I enrolled in the Lipscomb program there in the prison, and we didn't even realize who each other were because it was just that interpersonal nature of the system, especially when you get into the appellate phases. You never see your prosecutor on the appellate court side. And so the decision had came back, and he got a copy of it before I did. And I remember, like, outside of class, like, he just looked like so concerned and like just like really like wore down. He was like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm good. See you next week." And I didn't think anything of it until I got my appeal back, and I finally gathered myself up enough to read it, and there was his name on the first line. And so we had conversation after that, and I spent that whole weekend like really wrestling with that. But it's like, you know, this man has become my friend. Like, how could he argue for me to spend the rest of my life in prison? And I got to understanding that, you know, this is what we're talking about in his class, judicial process. We're talking about how there's just this impersonal nature of the system where like people don't really get to meet each other. And that's not just with the prosecutor and the person who's being charged, but it's also with the victim and like the offenders. And so it's like there's all these things that we don't really address through the system as it is. And so it was like, well, this wasn't him. Like this was him operating as an agent of this system. Right. And when we had that conversation afterwards, and he said, "Yeah, I'm finding a hard time trying to reconcile the person I know as you and the person in that case file."
Yeah, I think what you're pointing out is the adversarial system tends to objectify defendants. I mean, the prosecutor is on one side, the defense attorney is on the other side, and the prosecutor has a role is to convict you. And so it's much easier to carry out that job if you don't pay too much attention to the individual characteristics of the defendant and don't get to know the defendant, because then you might be acting outside your role. Yeah. So I thought that part of your book was very interesting.
It's one of the things you have to guard yourself against, I think, when you're in any government role, is the amount of problems and issues that come before you. And I mean, the example, I remember my wife Chrissy every now and then would say, "God, I just started such friend, and their brother's having a problem with Medicaid and blah, blah, blah." And I was always like, I can't do it. I mean, there's if I start looking at each of these individual cases, you get my point. It's you can't because of the flood, and I'm sure that's what happens with prosecutors. Right. So it's part of the thing that I think, again, those of us who end up being a part of the government need to always remember, like, these are people created in the image of God, and we have to not look at them that way. But it is so hard when the flood is so strong.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on that. I think during your terms as governor, you made a big push for education and training with respect to what are called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And so could you talk a little bit about that initiative and what your vision was with respect to that?
Well, I think just the realization, like I said, we just know a lot more about how the human brain develops now than we did 50, 100 years ago. And one of those things is we know the impact of ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And the more you have, we know that the more that's going to harm your brain development and the worse decisions you're going to make. And so, how we take all that into context in the judicial system is, we need a lot of us to figure out how to do that. But it did become important to us within the state while we were there to try to say, we have to recognize that that's a reality in people's lives. And let's start there when we start thinking about what's the solution.
So should prosecutors be told about a person's ACEs to try to individualize and personify?
I would argue yes. Now, they still, again, to balance things out, they still have the role of justice.
Sure.
And when crimes are committed, they still have the role of making certain that society is protected. But within that, they should understand, like, well, what's the context we're talking about here? I mean, that's what we do when we deal with people in our lives, right? Like, what's the context we're talking about? And if we can do that in these roles, we'll be a lot better.
So speaking of ACEs, Cyntoia, you had a lot of them. You were a victim of sex trafficking. I want to read 2 questions that came from the audience. And I don't know if they came from online or from the people who are here, but they have to do with sex trafficking. And I'd be interested in your reaction to the governor. If you have any reaction, I'd love to hear that too. Here's the first question. They're both related. Sex trafficking is a major problem here in Tennessee, yet many have no idea this is such a problem. What can be done to augment public awareness and shut down this awful industry? So that's the first question. The second one, very closely related. How can I help advocate for and support survivors of trafficking here in Nashville?
Yeah, you go first.
So I would say, number one, like, I feel like there's a big piece missing in our response, and that's prevention. And so we don't talk enough about prevention. We don't have enough funding for prevention. There's not, like, agencies who are doing prevention work because, they're doing service provision, which is great. We need that. They have advocacy. That's great. We need that, but we need prevention, so we can stop this from happening. We need more education on how it's happening, the modes of entry, because a lot of times people think, oh, well, these girls are just getting snatched off the streets, thrown into a white van, and shoved in a dungeon somewhere. And it's like, no, that's not how this is happening. And you can't really figure out how to stop it and how to prevent it from happening until you really understand, well, how does it happen? What contributes to this? And why is it that girls who run away from custody are more apt to be involved in sex trafficking? What's that connection there? What is it that we can do there? So, I feel like that's something we need to dig deeper into in terms of our response. And as far as you as an individual, whoever you are, for you to advocate and get involved, I would suggest you get connected to some groups locally who have a strong survivor presence. I'm very big on the survivor voice, dominating the conversation and our direction. And so that's where I would suggest that you start with. I know there are some organizations that are not necessarily in Tennessee that kind of do work on a national scale, and they can point you in the right direction. But that's what I would suggest that you do. Always start with the survivor. See what she wants you to help her with to advocate for.
That's great stuff. I had two thoughts. We ran a campaign when I was called This Is 13, with the idea of faces that you knew, and then they talked about what they were dealing with at 13, which is a lot different world than what folks who are dealing with a lot of ACEs, what their world looked like at 13. So it was just kind of a reminder, 13 doesn't look the same for all of us, and a good reminder. Again, I want to come back to, in the end, most things are personal. And if you can put it in that personal context, you'll be in a better place. So that's number one. Number two, agree 100% with the thought of what Cyntoia makes a great point. If we could spend some money here instead of later, we'll actually help and we'll save money with thinking about how we direct that. Here's part of the problem in government. Nobody ever gives you any hard time about anything where you spend money where you've always been spending money. Now, when you want to spend something new, then that gets really hard, okay? So in normal times, right now, state governments actually have more money than they normally do, but in normal times, you don't really have a whole new pot of new money to say, this is a good idea, let's start working on prevention. How can we help that 12-year-old girl, how can we help keep her from being on the streets when she's 16? And, there's not normally this big pot of money you can go start a new program with. But to do that, you probably have to say, we're going to do this instead of doing that. And you have to have people who are willing to take the hit for saying, we're no longer going to spend money on this other thing so that we can put it into prevention.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and that's sort of what the Project on Unity and
Right.
American Democracy is all about, is giving policymakers evidence. And there actually is some research suggests that money spent on prevention is much better spent than money spent on punishment.
Yeah.
And it sort of makes sense intuitively, right? It's just not what we've done. Like you say, there's a path dependency there. We're used to spending money on punishment regimes as opposed to prevention regimes. It would be nice if we could divert some of that money.
Yeah, the corollary, when we put in the free community college program, a lot of people on my side of the aisle are like, wait, free college, that doesn't sound like a Republican deal. And I was like, well, I think we're better off now, given the complexities of the world, having people have access to education. It'll save us money in the long term. We'll spend a lot less on that person when they're 65 than we invest in their education when they're 20. And it's the same, I think that's the same philosophy that Cyntoia's talking about.
I think to help prevent the kind of situation Cyntoia found herself in, it's also important for people to understand what sex trafficking in it
Right.
is. You make a good point in your book. A lot of people think of sex trafficking as young boys and girls being kidnapped and taken across
As
state
slavery.
lines, and sex slavery, that kind of thing. And that wasn't really what happened in your case. You had a relatively supportive family, but nonetheless, you ended up in the thrall of these individuals. You were very young. And I think that's something people need to understand, that there's not really an element of choice there, even though it might look like it.
Yeah, many of them are trying to survive, and like they don't have those options. They
Right.
don't have options to go in and go to college or get a job right then. Like I didn't have an ID card, and it's another thing that from that first question talking about something that I feel like we're not doing is like what are we doing to sustain like women who've recovered? Like I don't really see a lot of money that's going there. I don't really see a lot of programs that are really focused on, well, how are we helping these women once they go through the treatment programs, recovering from what they've gone through? What's next? Like, do we expect them to just go get a job at Winn-Dixie and like that's going to be good? I mean, what else? Like, what else is there? Like, is there education funds for them? Are there capital funds for them to go out and start the business they've always dreamed of? So like I just feel like there's a lot that we should be doing.
Yeah, those
Just
of you.
as a point of
sorry.
advertisement, that woman now can go to 2 years community college free, even if she hadn't
Right.
been in school in 30 years. So
Yes.
we are working towards some things like that. But your point's a really, really good one.
Yeah.
And there are organizations here in Nashville like Project Return that help with reentry. They're privately funded. Maybe they get some government funding too, but there are, if you guys are interested in working on this kind of thing, Project Return and organizations like it are very good in that regard. So I want to sort of a last series of questions. You're a very different person today than you were back then. And I think one very significant reason you are a different person, besides that you're older, is that you've got faith. You found faith while you were in prison. That's in part what your book is about. So what role do you think faith plays in rehabilitation? What role did it play in your life? And what role specifically did it play in helping you change your life?
So it really like pushed the needle like so far from where I thought it could be. I had spent 10 years without it. I had spent 10 years angry with God. And so here I was like, I'm applying myself to school and I'm getting all these great grades and that's all fine and well, but it was something was missing. Like I didn't have that sense of purpose. I didn't have that sense that, there was this presence that was with me and that was going to help me achieve things, and that there was a God who had a plan for me and was working everything out and who was walking with me through this journey. And that's what really came into play when I found my faith. And so now it's like I can handle so much more with grace and with humility because I have that faith. So it has helped me a lot in my full rehabilitation. I started a little bit, working on the programs and doing all that work, but like it really came around full circle whenever I developed that relationship with Jesus.
Yeah, Governor, I want to ask you the same question, maybe come back to Cyntoia. I mean, you also have written a book, which is here, Faithful Presence, The Promise and the Peril of Faith in the Public Square. And obviously, you're very devoted to your faith. What role do you think faith plays in the criminal justice system in terms of rehabilitation or in any other aspect?
So let me start. We live in a pluralistic society, and we don't want to have a state religion. I think one of the brilliant things about America is we've said religion's so important that the government can't play a role either way, either establishing it or prohibiting it. I think that's one of the things we've gotten right. So I don't ever want to say, well, we're going to only look for that as a symbol, as a recognition of a changed life. Okay, interesting. You'll appreciate this because you have these powers of pardon, and you get these applications, and people, because they knew of my faith, a remarkable number of them had religious experiences in prison. I don't mean to be cynical,
Right,
but
right.
because they're like,
I understand.
well, he'll be sympathetic to this argument. I'll make this. Cyntoia's was obviously not that, like I said, but so you have to be careful to not make that a condition. Okay. That being said, I think the reality for me was more this. What helped me the most was, as I said, it's really easy to sit here and say, well, the answer is to be merciful and to be merciful in all these cases. But like I said, we have a responsibility to be just too, and to be just and merciful. And what I love about the role what the God that I've grown to love is, he's a God of justice and mercy. It wasn't or. And that helped me as I thought through really hard situations, like I said, in hindsight, Cyntoia's wasn't as hard, but as you look through all those, we're called to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. Those are the three, and you need to do any two of those without the third isn't any good. And that command to be just and merciful and humble helped me sift through all these, and hope I got most of them right.
So just a specific question. Do you think prisons ought to offer classes on religious precepts? I mean, not require them. I think you made that clear. You don't think they should be required, but should this be one of the options along the lines of what Cyntoia was talking about? Or either one of you?
Well, I'll say this. Let me just clarify. So I grew up with religion. Religion didn't do anything for me. It was when I developed a personal relationship with him. So, I feel like there need to be opportunities for people to come in and have those services and minister. Yes, that's important. Require it? No, because until you're ready,
right.
It's not gonna happen. But, Lipscomb didn't come in as, a religious group. It came in as a community. Somebody just having community with us. We had built that connection. But in them, I saw people who really loved Jesus and wanted to live like him. And so it was man, I can get with that from whatever standpoint, because at that time I wasn't a believer. From whatever standpoint, it's I can get with that. And that's the kind of community, that's the kind of consistent, healthy relationship that leads people to change, especially when we're talking in the context of ACEs and toxic stress. That's what balances that out. So those types of programs that build that sense of community, I feel like that should absolutely be mandatory within the prison system.
And so, I would come back to my answer about religion in the public square is always going to be the same. Government should make no clause establishing it or restricting the free exercise. So within, should we welcome groups of faith? And if you do that, by the way, you got to welcome all groups of faith. You can't say only these folks who think like I do. That's how you have to approach that. I think that we should welcome that. My answer to most of the issues we face, and everybody thinks, well, the government should fix that. And we should, that's part of our role, but the real answer is more caring adults along the way. And whether they work for DCS or they're your 8th grade gym teacher, whatever it is, more caring adults along the way is how we're going to solve this.
So we have a little bit of time left, and I want to eventually ask you about what you're planning for in the future. But I want to ask one more question, which sort of builds off what you just said, Governor. And it's what I've alluded to before. We talked about in connection with Cyntoia's 51-year minimum sentence. Compared to Western Europe, American sentences are very lengthy, extremely lengthy. Western European sentences average about 1/3 the length of a typical American sentence. Juveniles cannot receive life sentences in Western Europe. On the other hand, in the United States, as I said before, 10% of prisoners are serving life without parole, and there are numerous people who committed crimes while juveniles who are serving life sentences. So I guess my question I'm addressing to both of you, but what is it about the United States that makes us so different in terms of punishment schemes compared to Western Europe, which granted is not the same culture, but it's in terms of countries around the world, it's the closest to us. And it seems that Western Europe seems to take a very different approach to how to construct a sentencing regime. Do you have any thoughts about that, either from the political perspective or any experiences you had, Cyntoia?
I'll start and then you can go to, but I think we need to do more of that period in government. Look around and say, what are our problems and who are people that are, having better results? I'm always, we should be about the outcomes. We talk a lot about inputs and all, but it should always be about the outcomes. And who are the people that have better outcomes than we do? And we have a system that, I think nationally, you probably know this number better, but we were still over, 50% plus recidivism. Mm-hmm. I think it's right, 55 to 60, we're still in that ballpark, okay? And if we have something like that, we have to look and say, that's not working. I mean, if you have anything where 55 to 60% of it fails and you have to go back, you have to say, well, that's not working. And so I'm one of those, let's have that conversation. Why do we have a larger percentage of our population in prison than almost, maybe all except 2 or 3 other countries. So why is that, and is it giving us the outcomes we want?
We have more people in prison than China does, just as an example.
I think we're the second or third highest percentage in the world, I think. So.
Yeah. Cyntoia, do you want to say something about that? Or?
I would just say that I've thought the same thing, especially like in the South, which, is considered to be, the Bible Belt to a lot of people. And so when I think about the Bible, I think about mercy. And, I think about Matthew, where he says to the Pharisee, where Jesus says, I don't care what's on the outside of your cup. You could be drinking from a mason jar, Waterford crystal jar, or a Dixie cup. It's about what's on the inside of it. And so is your cup filled with justice, with mercy, with compassion, or is it filled with corruption and greed? And so nearly everybody that I see campaigning, like they always talk about how they're people of faith. And it's like, well, when we talk about the justice system, when we talk about reform, where is that? I don't see that coming through. And so like, what is that disconnect? So that's something that I question a lot, and I have a lot of conversations wondering the same thing.
Well, it's another place where evidence and statistics can help, because Europe has much shorter sentences, but also lower crime rates. And so they're doing something differently than we are. It seems to be more successful. So it'd be interesting to do some more study of that. So I want to end just by asking you both, well, actually, I want to start with Cyntoia. What is in your future? I've heard rumors that you're thinking about law school. I'd love to have you in class.
Yes.
Is that in your future?
So, Mr. Bone, he's laughing in the audience right now. So I'm pretty sure he's the one that's told you this. He has been wanting me to. I've been wanting to. I'm doing a lot, and I've told him that, if a scholarship just falls in my lap, if somebody comes through and says, I'm going to pay for your law school, I'll make time to do it. I'll do it. But that hasn't happened yet, so we're still waiting.
Well, we'll pray and see.
Pray and see if it's in his will. But for now, I'm still doing work, out speaking about, the things that we've talked about tonight. Through our nonprofit organization, the JFAM Foundation, I've been doing a lot of work with our sister agency, which is Epic Girl, who is a prevention services program here. And they provide services to some of the most high-risk girls in Davidson County. So we're in the process of merging and coming together. They do all the runaway screens, and I really support what they do because it speaks more on the prevention side of things. And so we're looking for some property right now. Would love to open up a drop-in center for runaway kids who are like myself and found themselves on the streets, so they won't have to turn to some of the things that I turn to. They can come and they can get something to eat. They can come and they can rest, and they can come and find someone who could serve as a mediator between them and DCS if they're on the run, or them and whoever it is that has them, on the run at that time. So that's 2 things that I'm working on.
Yeah,
and then,
great.
of course, you mentioned Assistant Director of Center for Business's Mission at Lipscomb. So
Business as mission. So
Business as Mission, or BAM, as we call it.
Okay.
And so that's just a way to steward all of the opportunities that business provides in a way that confronts injustice in the world. And so I get a lot of opportunities to do some really cool things. We have started a business accelerator for underestimated entrepreneurs.
That's an interesting phrase, underestimated.
Underestimated entrepreneurs who traditionally wouldn't have access to capital or education. Many of them are formerly incarcerated. So we've been doing that. And also we're having a skills development day later on this month on the 25th for the boys at the Tennessee Children's Home. So getting them some business outfits and teaching them about, supply chain and other fun things. So,
That's terrific.
Yeah.
Isn't that cool?
Governor, any last words of wisdom for other?
Well, I do want to make one, and I want to tie this back to
Okay.
the Vanderbilt project on Unity and American democracy. One of the things we're trying to do in that project is realize that where you stand on issues depends on where you sit, right? And so Cyntoia and I've learned a lot about the justice system just from her, okay, and from other folks as well. That's because we might stand in like there's some issues that we might not come to the exact same conclusion, but that's partly because we've had really different experiences in life before. And, I might say, I get the thing on mercy, but I'm also, like I said, I've seen what happens on the other side when we don't have justice. So, but the point of the Vanderbilt project is to spend time with folks whose experiences aren't just like yours. We have an incredibly polarized country. I mean, that's like, everybody's like, no duh. And the only way we're going to change that is when we listen to people who don't think like we do. But today's world doesn't encourage that. We self-segregate into our own little pods of people who think and look just like what we are. So that's what we're trying to do with the Vanderbilt project. And this has been, like I said, I hope this has been a great example of things that will, no matter where you stand on some of these issues, you'll go home and think about them more.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, this has been a wonderfully enlightening discussion with the two of you, offering your unique insights into criminal justice. And we are very honored to be able to host your first public appearance together since 2019.
As you can tell, Cyntoia is bright, okay? No. She really is. And
you're going to write her a letter of recommendation.
Yeah, hey, I'm in. Okay. I'm the Charles Bone Scholarship to Vanderbilt Law. I'll even give to the fund. But I think the point is, you have somebody that's had the experiences that Cyntoia has and brings the intellect that she does to it. There's a lot to be gained by those kind of discussions. So anyway, thanks for hosting us. It's been fun to be a part of it, and I dodged your question about what I'm going to do next.
Yeah, in fact, I'm not going to ask you that. I'm not going to ask you that one.
You do learn some things being in politics for 16 years.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you again very much, and thank you, audience, for coming, and those of you in virtual world for coming, wherever you are. I'm sure we're to wave. But in any event, it's been a terrific discussion. If you are interested in revisiting the conversation we've had tonight, it has been recorded, and so you can get it off the website, the Unity and American Democracy website. And those of you who don't know, there are panel discussions like this, I think, at least once a month,
right?
Sponsored by the project. And if you're interested in them, you can go to, is it vanderbilt.edu/unity? I think it is. There's a newsletter. You can sign up for the newsletter, and we'll tell you what panels are upcoming. So with that, I want to thank again our two panelists. Terrific discussion. Thank you for coming. And I think the books are out there if you're interested. Right?
You got your books out there too.
I think so.
Thank you.